want to just set the scene for you. Those of you that are numbers fanatics, chartered accountants like myself, thank you, Colin, for not laughing at me then, will know that we received the 2021 census results were released at midnight on Tuesday. So I know all of you would have been waiting with bated breaths to dive into the data. Now, from here on, for the next couple of months, there is going to be better people than me that are going to analyse that data and draw some conclusions from it. But I'll tell you one big statistic that came out. There is now 9.9 million homeowners in Australia. So that is almost 50% of the population own a home. That is a massive number. That is why they're worth almost $9 trillion, bigger than the share market and superannuation and other investments and commercial property all added together. So it's where you should be. However, the biggest thing to take into account is in the last 30 years, we have more than doubled the number of apartments that are being owned around the countryside. It was bound to happen. We've been talking about it for decades. As the population grows, so too does density, and apartments are becoming a big, big part of the housing market. We're now more than $1.4 million, which is 15% of the housing market is in apartments. With that, what is also interesting, again, over the last 30 years, within those numbers of apartments, we have now tripled the number to roughly almost 50% of those are in what we would typically phrase as high-rise apartment buildings. That is, they are 4 or more stories high. Now, high-rise apartments, they get a good name, a bad name, a good rap, a bad rap. It depends who you talk to. But what I want to say to you, you cannot avoid them. Therefore, it is best to understand them, know what you're doing. That is part of the fine pillar, and importantly, managing your experience and expertise is what we want to do. Why do I say that? Well, oils ain't oils. Those of you that were around in the 80s, like me, like Scott and Colin, although he was from Canada, so he knows nothing, will remember this great Castrol ad from back there where it was meant to be a mafia-style scene, and they said, oils ain't oils. Now, bring that into today's market. Buildings still ain't buildings. What are we talking about here? The number one issue facing most people when they're looking at buying into a high-rise apartment building is cladding. So guys, come on out, join us here. I will take a seat, and we talk about this a lot. So Scott, strata manager to the stars, as well as a few no-names like ourselves. Big Mac needs no introduction. He is the self-professed smartest man in the room and the best-dressed builder that we all know. Yes, okay. Well, thank you. So before we get into this, you'd have to be living under a rock to not have seen the images a few years ago coming out of London with that building and the cladding burning down. We see it around the countryside. It's a discussion, and there's obviously some issues in different states from different places. But for the layman, and I think most of our viewers, they would just say, oh my God, cladding, and that's it. It's all too hard for them, and they walk away. Now tell us why cladding ain't cladding. What is it? How does it work? And why should we not be so worried?
It's a funny word. I mean, when you
just grab the mic.
Oh, sorry. I feel like
you don't have a booming voice like me.
It's like Johnny Carson show. I mean,
it is. We don't have levels yet. We will get levels, as you know. That's important.
You what, I feel weird. Anyway, that word itself is kind of nebulous. I mean, we think about it in terms of risk.
Nobody knows what nebulous means either.
Okay, I think they do. It's just it's one of those words that sort of evokes fear, concern, and all that type of thing. And the reality is, when we think about a building, the cladding, the outer skin, the envelope consists of many things. And certainly within the apartment space, the vast majority of the building is concrete. I mean, when you look around the city here in Melbourne, concrete glass is 95%. It's only when architects start to get a little bit fancy, you begin to see other types of cladding come in. Now, I brought a couple of props. I love props here.
So while he's grabbing the props, I mean, Scott, the number one question I guess you get asked as a strata manager all the time is, does the building have cladding?
The microphone there.
And I guess that's a hard thing for you to say, because of course you've got to say yes.
Well, that's right.
Because everything has cladding, otherwise we'd be living with only 3 walls, I guess.
That's correct, and as Colin said, most buildings, the core of it, the bones are solid, concrete, steel and glass. That envelope, you do have cladding. It's not so much about whether cladding's present, but the type of cladding and at what stage in, if it's required, further remediation, what stage in that process you're up to. So it's not, the end game when you hear cladding. It's just, that little bit of further investigation.
Okay, so we shouldn't fear because every single building has cladding. Now, Big Mac, show us a few examples.
Okay, I mean, going back to the buildings and buildings, cladding, I mean, the reality
Don't
is
you wish you had this ad in Canada?
it's not even get it. Anyway, this is an example. I mean, this is and often used in cladding. This is actually a plastic. It's designed to look like timber. It's the newest and greatest thing. This is a type of thing that might be affixed to the ground floor plane. In fact, there's a building just next door where it's got something similar to that. Do you mind if I hand it to you? This is stone cladding. So certainly a lot of the smaller boutique apartment buildings might have this type of stone mechanically fixed to the outside of the building. That's the type of cladding. And then of course you've got glass, and we often see these decorative glass panels everywhere. So when we talk about cladding, there shouldn't be this overarching fear where you think, oh gosh, there is some form of cladding on the building. What we're really concerned about is cladding that has the possibility of spreading fires. And if you really think about it, the essence of the risk currently that we're hearing about now, and of course all these orders are coming out from council, is anything that is like a composite panel. So ACP, aluminum composite panels, or EPS, expanded polystyrene. These are the key risks, and they are risks because in the case of fire, they do not cause fires, but in the case of fire, they have the possibility of spreading it. And really, that is the essence of the risk. It isn't that they'll combust, it is that they can spread the fire if there is a fire.
So the question that our viewers should be asking of the vendors, of the real estate agents, of the strata managers is not, does the building have cladding? It's, does it have combustible cladding?
Absolutely.
And tell us, how do we get here? Like, why are we in this situation that, we're now living in a state of fear?
In this day and age, we're dealing with things that
I
burn
mean,
down
clearly
buildings.
you weren't around when all these buildings were done.
Well, unfortunately I was. But look, it is a funny one. And, it's one of the industry is always learning. Many years ago, you would know we were able to put timber in common areas and we weren't concerned about combustibility because we really looked at the substrate of the building. We said, well, if the substrate is concrete and the thing we affix to it is combustible, well, we're still protected by the envelope. Now, at that time, we hadn't considered, the evolving use of apartments. So now we're putting condensers on balconies. They have the potential to create fires through sparks, or indeed people putting their washing right next to it. And as soon as that combusts, that has the potential to spread fires. And we didn't think about this a long time ago. We used to go and say, well, it's fixed to concrete so that, all the residents are protected. But of course, and if you look at the data, the issue right now is that the combustible cladding that we do have combusts at something like 600 degrees C, but fires burn at 800. So, this type of raw data wasn't available many years ago. And it's one of those things where VBA, we're operating under approved designs. It wasn't that builders or building surveyors were negligent, that they didn't think about it. In fact, they did think about it, and it was part of the building permit process. And that's why Victoria has been really a big challenge. And companies like us, and you'll remember, the most recent development we did, $100 million development, and we had to pay $820,000 to the government.
Did you hide that from us?
Before you saw those checks, you should look at them more closely. But 820 grand we paid, not because we had cladding, but because the government has needed to respond to buildings all around the city and put a program together to rectify them. So that money goes from us to a fund, and those funds begin to support owners corporations to have them rectified. Now, why does that happen? Because a long time ago it was acceptable, and now they're trying to make sure they minimize the risk. And every development we do, as you know, the next development we're doing at Johnson Street, that's 400 million. So you can imagine the quantum of funds that we'll be up for.
So I just need to check it with a heart medication ready.
That's why I actually don't check it.
So just thinking about what you're saying though, how did it happen? What you're saying is it's not necessarily, whilst there might be some bad apples, it's not necessarily that people were negligent per se. It's just we didn't know what we didn't know.
Yeah.
And as we're evolving, we're realizing, right, if you do this and it's used this way, it's okay. But if it's used this way, it's not okay.
Yeah. And we didn't think at the time. And when I say we, I mean the community did not, think at the time of, things like laundry next to AC condensers.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a perceived risk. And, if you look at buildings, in fact, that we've done before, products were fire rated. They had literally a certification for its use. And in hindsight, they've now said, okay, well, that shouldn't be used and we need to take steps. So it isn't an indictment of industry experience or intent. It is purely that the industry is learning and that fire safety measures remains paramount. It's not one of those things where you can say, well, we'll get to it when we want to. Essential safety measures are absolutely critical, from an insurance perspective and from an owner's perspective. So
I've got two questions that I've just seen popped up on the screen. I want to ask you both. So first of all, Scott, just thinking about what Colin was saying and the unknown and what we're learning now, what does that mean for you as a strata manager and I guess owners corporation committees and the residents generally, where Colin sort of said, it might be okay if things are maintained this way, but it won't be okay if it's there. That obviously is putting back the onus, I guess, on you as the strata manager, the committee to, I guess, maybe there's a reason why you don't let people hang out there washing like downtown Vietnam on the balconies for, I guess, what Colin was saying.
Absolutely. I mean, good principles around building management, owners corporation management, start with the foundation of safety. Whether you've got cladding present or not, doesn't matter whether it's minimal or there's, it's extensive. Good building management practice is to underpin the safety of residents, protect the asset by having, and Colin alluded to it, effective essential safety measures in place. Now, these are mandated by the occupancy permit. They need to be abided by. Whether that happens or not really comes down to the person at the helm or the group of people at the helm. The builder, developer can build the building, then it's really passed on to the owners and the owners corporation management team in conjunction with the building management team to then take it from there and maintain it and keep it safe. So, in a roundabout way of answering your question, to safeguard the safety of the building and to ensure that, the building is compliant, it's active management. It's having an understanding of your building, the regulations and the requirements, putting in plans place, resourcing them accordingly to make sure that you can maintain that safety and security of the building and asset.
So, whilst some people might say, oh, look, this is just dodgy building, it's just as important that you don't have dodgy strata management, because that can also, irrespective of this combustible cladding issue as a whole, that can lead to safety issues that can be just as bad, if not worse, than this combustible cladding. Okay, the other question before we move on, I think might be for you, Colin. Someone said, didn't this cladding just come about because it's cheap?
Oh, good. No, I mean, it's extremely expensive. In fact, it's, if you look at many of the iconic buildings here in Melbourne, that cladding, in particular, the aluminium look, was an extra over that was designed to give it some color or some design feature that was absolutely unique. So in fact, it's totally the opposite of that. It's, you're spending hundreds of thousands or in some cases millions to affix this to building. And really, I guess that's the disappointing part, because people are going out of their way to do what we do best in Melbourne, which is put an amazing design together. And unfortunately, it's ended up actually causing other unknown consequences.
Yeah.
And so just to tie into what Scott was saying, I mean, when you look at it and we think about, that proactive strata management and building management activity, placing garbage in a fire escape has an exponentially higher risk than many of these other elements. And in fact, if you look around here in Melbourne, there isn't a lot of fires caused by combustible cladding. And credit to the VBA and all the authorities, they're trying to be proactive. It isn't an equivalent pandemic, but things like blocking fire escapes, and not having fire extinguishers that are checked and not making sure your fire alarms are working and so on. The risks associated with that are exponentially higher. And we obviously manage many buildings, and from time to time there's fire alarms. You can imagine if your fire escape was blocked.
Yeah.
I mean, that happens a lot more often. So, you know,
Is that why Scott has no hair?
I
He's
think
been
so.
pulling it out.
I think it's the
stressing
same.
about that.
Yeah. You know, it's one of those things where while that whole thing is very, very scary for owners corporations, it is one of the many risks that we need to deal with and be proactive about. And you know, that proactivity of managing the building from not just from a high level, but a micro level, making sure all of your essential measures safety measures are in place, is as important as dealing with these cladding safety issues.
So would it be fair to say, whilst it was horrific and terrible for all of us to see what happened in London, and particularly for the victims, it was almost a bit of a good wake-up call for everyone to kind of look back and say, well, you know what? If that did happen, how did everyone get out of the building? Because I know that was some of the issues there, that it wasn't just the combustible cladding,
Right.
It was everything that some of those people couldn't get out because fire escapes were blocked. They couldn't get through. And so maybe, you know, if we can look for a silver lining, is that it's reminded the diligent people, the ones that have got good strata managers, good building managers, you know, might even be lucky enough to have the great Colin McKenzie somehow involved, that are, you know, double checking, making sure, and even potentially improving the rest of the safety measures.
Well, I mean, you make a good point there. And part of that is, you know, when you, let's say we have a building and you actually receive one of these notices or orders, that process of undertaking that rectification work does not happen in a day. I mean, we are talking many months, but making sure that all of your other essential safety measures are in place can happen instantly. You know, making sure that your smoke detectors are working, your fire escapes are free and unencumbered. You know, these are the absolute imperatives that we have. And you're exactly right. A wake-up call. You know, we take these things for granted. We don't think about fires. We don't think about, you know, how could they spread or what happens if they do spread. So yes, you're right. It is a silver lining to a tragic event, but something that perhaps our industry needed. And what's interesting about it is now, as we approach design, there's an extra level of conservatism. So even if something's approved, we don't just take it for granted. There's that level of extra inquiry that we might not have had, you know, a decade ago, or even in more recent times when this wasn't, you know, a prevalent issue.
Okay, so let's change gear for a moment. So if you can, and it suits you, buying a brand new building is potentially your best bet, because you've got all these extra checks you're talking about. For those of you that are looking for something that's been around for a couple of decades, even potentially, you know, was completed less than, or, you know, a bit more than 5 years ago, you may have been unlucky to get this. So this is on a building Scott looks after. Colin and all of his building management team work intimately with Scott on this particular building. This is what you never want to see. But I guess, like the guys said, it's not the end of the world. It just means you need to work through it. And one of the things that I'd like to get a bit of an understanding from you guys is, it's never good to see, but you guys didn't fear. You didn't run away and hide, at least as far as I know, and you're able to proactively get through it. So, you know, this is not a good thing to get. This will be, for those of you that are wondering, do you have a combustible cladding issue on your current home or potentially a home you're looking at? This notice will be on the council certificate that you'll get for each individual property, and it will show you any building order. So it is something for about $50, $60. You can apply for a search and get it. But if you've got a good strata manager, they will know what it is. It'll be in the minutes. They'll be all across it, because, you know, this is probably one of the biggest issues, I guess, for you, Scott, that you haven't seen, you know, I guess, particularly in your career and would span most of strata living, where we've had this mass issue of building orders coming through. So, you know, hopefully you didn't get a ton of it, but I assume you probably got a few of these over the last few years.
Yeah. And you're spot on. I think it was just before I received this one that I last had hair, and I think this was the this is the final one. No,
that's his excuse. What's yours?
Yeah.
I couldn't travel to India to get the hair plugs yet. Pandemic, that was my fault.
But no, James is right. You know, no one wants to see this. It's not pleasant, but it's not insurmountable. It is simply another challenge that an effective building management team supported by the owner base can overcome, or needs to overcome, and you do overcome it. cool heads will always prevail when you receive these sorts of things.
So walk us through, guys. Here is the before. We're going to walk through and the guys will explain what is involved. Now, the reason I wanted to share this with you guys was one, that you can understand it isn't the end of the world. It can be fixed and it can be resolved. And it's all about having the experience, the expertise, and the appropriate time to be able to do it. And that is why those of you that don't have a strata manager in a smaller building may struggle, because most of you probably don't know what you're doing. And those of you that have got inexperienced strata managers won't actually know what's needed, won't be able to get it done, because look, it's something that you shouldn't fear, but you can't sit on it. You need to get it done. You need to get that order removed. And more importantly, as the guys have said, you need to get that safety going. So the issue here, as Colin said, the entire building is clad. That is why it is watertight. So you've got concrete, you've got glass. This beautiful red coloured fin here was the issue, the combustible cladding. So guys, tell us, first of all, how do we pay for these works in this building?
Take that.
Well, once received, it's about being proactive. You know, these like many problems in life, if you bury it, it doesn't go away. It gets worse and worse and worse. And, you know, with the cost of materials increasing, as I'm sure you can both attribute to, burying these issues doesn't bode well in the long term. So who pays? I suppose the starting point is what the remediation action that's required that needs to take place, because it doesn't always have to be full removal. You'll have a couple of options for remediating the problem, which is the combustible cladding. That may be partial removal. That may be leaving it in situ, but then having a fire engineered design solution. What that could be would be additional sprinkler systems, fire protection assets to mitigate the risk of that combustible cladding spreading if it did catch alight. So identifying the solution early is key to managing the cost of the actual remediation itself. In the case of this building, the order was received. It was referred to CSV, so Cladding Safety Victoria. Cladding Safety Victoria is a government body put together to help owners, corporations and building owners, excuse me, navigate the process of remediating a cladding order. And that can be in a number of different forms, by providing guidance, putting the owners corporation in touch with the relevant building surveyors or project managers or contractors to get the works done. Another element that the CSV provides is possible funding for different owners corporation buildings to remediate the cladding. We were lucky enough through different relationships or managing and building relationships with key people within the CSV, being timely in the response and going along with a solution-focused approach gives you a better chance of being eligible for some of this funding. This building was in fact eligible for the funding and did receive the project fully funded, including the project manager and the contractor, the relevant engineers and consultants, with the exception of a small variation that came up during the works. So to answer the question, who pays? CSV can, but there are a number of other funding options available. In some cases, though, the owners corporation will need to defray the cost of their own rectification. But again, it's not insurmountable, and there are solutions around that.
And I think that ties back to, when we're talking about the pillars, I talked about the experience and expertise. I think you're a little humble there. There's many strata managers that have gone, tried and failed in the past. And it is having the experience, having the expertise that you guys were able to secure that funding, which is a huge benefit for owners, because, this was a small building, but there was a big cost to do this. When you have a look at the work, and Colin might walk us through some of these photos in a moment, there was a lot to do, because whilst it was a small amount of combustible cladding to remove, when you're going 10, 12, 13, 15 stories up into the sky, there is a lot of safety that's involved around that. And it is something that needs to be dealt with. And those costs can go. And of course, unforeseen things can pop up, which if you have the great Colin McKenzie, you may be able to minimize the cost of those, for others may not. And that's again why it is important to call on that. So Big Mac, tell us here. That just looks expensive to me.
Yeah,
it hasn't even started.
And it is. I mean, first of all, you have to look at the location of where all that composite paneling is. So we're talking about accessing individual strata lots. There's coordination of all the tenants. Then we're moving through those lots, with grubby, dirty guys who are pulling parts of the facade apart. You've got mechanical fixings all over the place. There's a big cleanup component. And of course, you've obviously got the edge protection. They're working on a live edge. How do you scaffold that? How do you protect the workers and indeed the public? So that prior photo that you showed was not about protecting the workers, but for materials falling off the building. So the costs are astronomical. And unfortunately, they can and often do provide evidence of other problems. So composite cladding is not super glued to concrete. It's typically
doesn't
fixed.
just magically appear.
No, it doesn't magically appear. And there's no Bunnings adhesive that you can buy, right? So we're talking about typically mechanically fixed, and the fixings are often on, as you can see here, steel framing components. You've heard of Pandora's box before. So unfortunately, it can be Pandora's box. If you don't quite understand the process, you can begin to remove the cladding, and that will show you things like rusting fixings. And these fixings are critical to the entire steel structure. And that can, of course, lead to additional costs that may or may not be covered by CSV in your agreement with CSV. So when you're approaching the problem, you cannot do it with eyes closed. You really need to go and dig deep and understand, what is the issue? What are the options? As Scott sort of identified, you can get what they call a performance solution. Might be available to the owners corporation to minimize the cost to the owners by finding different ways to manage the combustibility. Or indeed, you might find yourself in this situation where there's on costs that may partially be covered by your agreement with CSV and some that will not. And that's why you need to be proactive, and you need to make sure, despite all of the good efforts of CSV, their project managers are there to deliver an outcome for CSV, not necessarily the owners corporation. They are not your friend. They're not there to enrich you. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that proactivity, making sure that you are part of the process. Don't just leave it to Cladding Safe Victoria. If you have funding, it's that famous adage: you have insurance for something, but yet your deductible is so high that the value of the insurance is useless. This is one of those situations. So we start by, first of all, identifying, does it need to be replaced? Those orders, you read the wording, my God, I mean, they're words of nightmares. You must rectify, you are required. The reality is the process isn't as definitive as the notice. It's a statutory obligation they have. But, working with your building surveyor, working with your fire engineer, identify, first of all, do I need to do it? Second of all, what are the options that I have available? And then third of all, if I do it, what are the associated costs? And that comes with experience, as you said, and making sure you wrap up your agreement with CSV to make sure that the owners corporation does not bear a cost that we're not foreseeing. So it's not, it's not an easy process, but it is something that if you have the experience, you understand how to do it, you can certainly mitigate the costs.
So, that, I guess, to me, sounds like one of my favorite sayings is stitch in time saves nine.
Absolutely.
So Scott, how do you manage this? Because I've never heard of an owners corporation that likes spending money. Typically, they all don't want to spend a penny. And I guess what Colin's saying is you need to invest up front in getting the engineers, getting the certifiers, getting everyone involved to work out the options. And you go, is that a hard process? And how, does someone like yourself able to add value to the strata committee?
It's not easy.
Or am I wrong? Does everyone like spending money?
Well, no, unsurprisingly not. However, it can be made easier. And I think this is coming back to what we were alluding to or saying earlier around a solid foundation for building management well before any of this happens or comes to light. Through doing that, both the OC manager or strata manager and the building management team build trust and confidence with the owner base. And when you have trust and confidence with your owner base, when something like this happens, having those hard conversations, presenting at an AGM around this may cost X, they may not like it, but at least you're not having to combat mistrust and a lack of confidence in what you're delivering. So having those two in place is key, because then everything else as unpleasant as it can be, it's a process with commercial hats on and commercially minded solutions. So never easy, but it's about working through, again, the options, demonstrating through the thorough, proactive, timely response that you've exhausted every possible outcome to save the owners corporation from spending more than they have to. When you've distilled it down to that point, the owner base has the confidence that yes, you have done that. They trust that the consultants and the experts you've engaged to advise them know what they're talking about. And then it's an easier pill to swallow. Again, you know, it's going to choke slightly on the way down, but the owner base knows that it needs to happen, and you've built that into it, that delivery. And then from that point forward, it's about honest, open conversations with the committee, with the owners around the best way to finance it, whether through CSV funding, loan facility, or special levies. And you work with the owner base, not against them. It's not about dictating terms to owners which I'm not an owner in these properties. You know, I'm managing on behalf of owners, managing their finances and their funds. I'm not going to dictate terms as to how we're going to fund this, but I will present the best, most realistic options that are going to lessen the impact of that financial burden to best assist them to get the outcome that's required. So it's not easy, but trust and confidence goes a long way. Demonstrating you've done your job properly also goes a long way too.
All right, now conscious of time, but there's two things that I want to say there. First of all, ladies, get this man a contract. I'm sure we can sell him something there because he said he doesn't own anything yet. The second thing I think is, you know, Scott went into a great amount of detail there, but the key thing to take away from that is that if you don't have trust and confidence in your strata manager and your owners corporation committee, then perhaps you need to look a different angle. So Scott, I know he's got his book here. He's ready to take your calls and sign you up for a replacement strata manager. But seriously, it is important to have that trust and confidence, because ultimately, if you remember back to the managed pillar, it was about thinking about your time, experience, and expertise. For 99.99% of you, you won't understand what this is. It isn't your field of expertise, and you need to rely on experts, and you need to have someone that does this day in, day out, that can go and engage those experts. You can have trust in them that they know what they're doing, which is why we always work with Scott and his team on all of our new buildings. And I implore all of you out there, if you don't have that trust, then think about it, understand where you sit with your strata manager, and have that hard conversation as to whether that's the right partnership going forward. Now, I want to just wrap up with some good news here. Here is the after photo. Now, for those of you that remember the before photo, it looks identical. Now, the reason why I wanted to show this is, you know, it's going back to Colin's initial thing when I asked him about cladding, and he said, cladding ain't cladding, because there's plenty there. And combustible cladding can look just like this cladding here, which is safe and has been replaced. So, you know, for those of you wandering past buildings on your Saturday or Sundays, when you're out there thinking, maybe is this the right place? Just because you see what might look like combustible cladding, it does warrant going a little bit deeper. As I said, for a few dollars, or just asking the strata manager, you'll be able to find out the truth, because every single building in Victoria supposedly has been audited by the state government. So it doesn't mean that they've got 100% of them, but they've captured the vast majority of the ones that have got issues with combustible cladding. They've issued those building orders, and you will see that there. So don't immediately discount a new place, because the good news is when it's done right, done by the team that know what they're doing, you will end up with this great piece of paper here. This is worth about $650,000. And what it says up here, cancellation of building order. So that now confirms for all of those people out there that were concerned, not only existing owners, but potential new residents, whether they be owners or tenants, that this has now been complied with, the building order no longer stands, and that combustible cladding has been rectified. In this case, it was replaced, but as Scott and Colin talked about, there could have been other measures taken. So, you know, I think I take away from this is that nothing is insurmountable. With the right team, the trust, it can be done, and it can be done in many different ways, some costing a lot of money that you may get funded and others that could be cheaper. All right, now I just want to wrap up here, but is there anything you guys want to add? Any takeaways? Scott, maybe you want to hold up your number and say 1-800 call Scott.
I'll just add to that point that you just said there. It's really about being proactive. And I think that's the message of the day is if a council notice comes or an order comes, you cannot dig your head in the sand. You need to get the experts around you to give you options. And that's what's going to determine your fate, whether or not you spend a lot of money, a little bit of money, or no money at all.
Scott, any last thing?
I'll just support that. It's about being proactive, no head in the sand, and seeking out that support from people that you trust and have confidence in, whether that be the original developer, builder, to get the job done. Okay.
And if you don't know who your strata manager is, then they're probably not doing a good job because you should see them at your building. However, I can't always say that's 100% their fault because you may have your head buried in the sand, in your Xbox, whatever it is that you do inside your apartment all the time, but get to know them because they are your friend. As Scott said, he's there for you. He's not there because he owns an apartment in the building. However, if you're smart, get him to buy one, but he's there for you guys. So you should know him and you should leverage that expertise because that is one of the key pillars in my framework.